Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sly Slime. We are back in the chess game. Last time we talked about fill clocks and we went through the setup of all the scoreboards and all the surrounding things. We talked about how the game is in its setup phase. We're right here waiting for game to start, and then when we start, we left off with this whole row of glowstone turning into redstone blocks. So today we're going to start with looking at all of these blocks and seeing what they all do. This is the setup of the game. Once we have two players joining in, we obviously need to get all the pieces on the board and get the entire game into a state where it's ready to start playing. So let's have a look at these. Now, this is the summoning command for one of the pawns. These are quite long, so I'm going to try to put up an overlay. So let's go through this one piece at a time. So, we summon an armor stand, and it will be at 0, 81, 1. Now, if we take a look at that, you find that it is on the first row of the board, right here. It's at 1, so the x-coordinate is this direction, right? The x-coordinate is along the line of pieces, and the z-coordinate is across the board. And, whoops. And the board itself is at height 80, and we want them one block above, so we're spawning them at height 81. Now, we don't want the gravity to affect these because we want to be able to move them around just as we want. Pawns are not so important, but as you can see, the knight, for instance, is slightly offset off of the ground because he's sort of sitting on the horse. So we just turn off all the gravity on all of these pieces. It doesn't have a base plate because it looks nicer if we don't. It's a small armor stand because we want all the pawns to be smaller than the more powerful pieces. It has a disabled slots of 14. We'll go through that more later. We're using the disabled slots field to disable interaction with the pieces that you couldn't interact with at any certain moment. So when you pick up a skull from, say I pick up this skull of this pawn, then this pawn would have his, or its rather, disabled slots field set so that you can't interchange the skulls with that one because you can't strike that pawn with this pawn. So every time the state of the game updates, we change the disabled slots field of all the pieces to make sure that the only ones you can interact with are the ones that you are supposed to be interacting with. The same with the black team versus the white team. When it's the white player's turn, you haven't picked up a piece, you can't pick up the pieces of, or the heads of the black pieces. And then comes the equipment. So there's quite a lot of equipment going on here. The first field is empty. That's their hands. So as you can see, these guys have no hands, they're not holding anything. But the rook behind him is holding a sword. So there's nothing in that field, it's just left empty. He has iron boots, iron leggings, iron chest plate, and then a skull. He has one skull. You have to set the count because otherwise when you pick it up it would say 0 on your bar and it would look, it would work kind of weird. We set the damage to 0 to have a full health bar on it, and then we set a tag. I don't know if the repair cost is strictly necessary. I left it in from when I was experimenting in it. But the display part is very, very important. So you can see if I pick this up, you see it says white pawn, and that's the name of this item. So the skull is named white pawn, and that is very significant. And then we're done with the equipment, and we have a custom name set on it. It's W_pawn1, which actually is no longer important. I was using the names to identify pieces in an earlier version of the game, but that made promotions very, very hard. And then there's a tag for the armor stand itself as well. So the summon command is quite complicated just for that little pawn. Now, here's another one. As you can see, this one doesn't have the final tag one. So that was also an experiment and turned out to be unnecessary, so we could remove that. We have third pawn, fourth pawn, and so on until this one, which is the eighth pawn. So here we're done with the pawns. You see I put these blocks to mark when we're done with a certain piece. And as you could probably figure out, on the other side we have the first pawn on the black side, second pawn, and so on, all the way up here to where we have the last pawn. Next we're going to make the more complicated pieces. So we have our rook. As you can see, there are quite a lot of similarities. One of the difference is that it has a piece of equipment in its first slot. So it's holding an iron sword. Other than that, it's pretty much the same, right? So if you look at that, you can see that the armor stand for the rook is pretty much just a bigger version of the armor stand for pawn. And the difference there is we have small set to 0. So we have two of those, obviously. We have here W rook 2 and W rook 1, and then the same for over here, black. Now from here starts the fun parts. So a knight is actually made up out of two separate entities, not two armor stands, but two entities. So here we're summoning a horse, and it will be at 181-0, which means that it's on the second square of the first row, because all of these rows start at 0. So we summon two horses. They have no AI set to 1, which means that they don't walk around by their own. The variant is the color you want them to be. And there's a whole bunch. You have to look that up on the Minecraft wiki if you want to know the exact ones. And then we put an iron horse armor on it as an armor item. And then we spawn the knight itself. So one more difference between pawns and the other ones is that we have show arms set to 1. So that shows the arms, and it shows them holding something. Now this one is at 81.5 in Y, so it's actually raised half a block from the bottom. You can kind of see it here, and that's to just account for the horse it's sitting on. It's holding an iron axe, and in addition to that, it also has a pose tag. So the pose is a little structure that sets 3 angles for every limb, so to speak. So it has a left leg with 3 angles, right leg with 3 angles, right arm with 3 angles, and the left arm with 3 angles. If you choose to set them, you can leave them out. So we have a left leg and a right leg set, and that's to make it look like he is sort of sitting in a saddle rather than has his legs straight down through the horse. And then he also has a right arm pose that holds the axe up and brandishes it like that. So that creates a knight. Now you can see that on the white side we have 4 blocks, and on the black side we have 6 blocks, and that is because of a bug in Minecraft. So when we summon, let me show you this block. When we summon the horse, we set a rotation of 180 degrees around, and that is supposed to spin them around, making them face the other way. So this doesn't look quite right, does it? And that is a bug in Minecraft where it doesn't properly save the rotation of the horses, and it doesn't properly save the rotation when it spawns them, which means that they actually spawn in the wrong way even though we set the rotation. So what these do is a slight delay with the repeater, and then we actually teleport them to the same spot again, but turn them 180 degrees around. So now they're in the right place and in the right direction. And these ones are for the bishops. They are the same as the other ones, but you can see the differences in equipment. The bishops are equipped with a chainmail shirt and a bow instead of the normal iron armor. Same on this side. And then we have the more complex pieces. So we have a queen, and the queen is made up out of two pieces. It's made up out of one piece that is essentially the same as all the other pieces. Is a full armor stand with arms, and it has a full set of iron armor on it, and it has a head. In this case, it's not a skull, it's a player head with one of the special textures that are available from Mojang. But then we also have a separate, sorry, not that one, separate armor stand that is summoned a slight bit. It's a quarter block above. It's an invisible armor stand, and its only purpose is to have a chainmail helmet with the name White Queen. So now we can play the chess by picking that piece up, because we are not actually picking up the head. So my initial thought was we would pick up the head, and this crown that is a chainmail armor would only be a decoration, and you click through it to get the head. However, it turns out that the hitbox is still there, even if you disable the slot. So we have to play with the crown. That's the only way we can do it right now. And then finally, we have 3 blocks here for the king. Now we summon an armor stand that is the same as all the other pieces. We summon similarly an armor stand with only a chainmail helmet that is named White King. And then finally we summon a king banner one that is only an armor stand with a banner in it that's summoned in a different position, in a different height. Now, as we've done all of this, we can use execute commands to find a box of armor stands and set their side to 0, and then we find a box of armor stands on the other side and set their side to 1. So this means that up here, all of these pieces, all the white ones, are now in a scoreboard called side. Scoreboard objective set display sidebar side. So a whole bunch of those are side 1, a whole bunch of them are side 0. So from now on we can use that scoreboard to determine which side a piece is on once we've found it, and we'll be using that a lot in a whole array of different execute commands to figure out if something is a valid move, if something is a striking move, and so on. And then we have a bunch of blocks here that set up more scores. So we select all the armor stands in a box that is on the first row and set them to pawn, or rather set their score in the pawn scoreboard to 1. We set a certain place, just one square rook to 1, and then the other rook to 1. So we're selecting the pieces by their position, because at this point we actually know what their position is, so we can set their scores to the correct, rather set their score to 1 in the correct scoreboard, so we can then later differentiate their types. These blocks on top are all the same for the black side, but we also have blocks on this side that do something interesting. So here we're summoning another armor stand, and we're summoning it as 0, 60, 0. Whoops. It doesn't have gravity, and it's small, and it has a name, and its name is board. So this chessboard is at height 80. This armor stand is summoned at height 60. So this is actually underground somewhere, and I will show you later. Now we're summoning another one called board at 160. 0. So now we have 2 armor stands. They're standing next to each other at z equals 0 and at height 60. Now, let the fun begin. We have 2 of them called board, so we're going to execute a command for both of them. And for each one of them, we're going to summon an armor stand, and it's going to be 2 spaces away in X. Since we have 2 ones, and we're summoning a new one for each one of them, that means that we now have 4 armor stands called board, and they're standing at x equals 0, x equals 1, x equals 2, and x equals 3 at z equals 0 at height 60. And I think you can guess what this block does. So now we're going to execute for all of those 4 ones. We're going to summon an armor stand that's going to be 4 spaces away in X, which means that suddenly we now have a whole row, 8 armor stands standing at height 60 and at Z equals 0. So now we can repeat that for the Z direction. We take all of those 8, and now we make 8 new ones, and then we take all of those 16, and we made 16 new ones, and now we're 32, and then after this block, we now have 64 armor stands, and they're going to be standing at the exact spaces of the board. So if we teleport to 0, 60, 0, whoops, we're going to end up in this room full of armor stands. And now, at first glance, this doesn't really do much. We already had a box of glowstone up there that told us where the board was. However, we can execute commands on entities in the world, and these armor stands are all entities, which means that we can now execute a command for each square on the board. Now, if we execute a command for everything named board, and execute the command at position, whatever the position it is, but at height 80, then we are going to get all of these blocks up here. Which means, for instance, we can do execute at E, aim equals board, tilde 80 tilde, detect, 80 tilde, lapis block, this one, set block tilde tilde tilde, emerald block, swoosh. So as you can see, it spams the log quite a bit, which is something you won't see when it's executed as a command block, but what we have created for ourselves is the possibility to simultaneously run a command on all the blocks on the board, given that they match a certain block. So what I did right here was to find all lapis blocks and replace them with an emerald block. Now what we'll be doing later when we are playing the game is we'll be temporarily setting blocks to different blocks that have different meanings, and then checking them versus other blocks. So let's just place this back for now. This block, and we're back to our starting position. So that's why we have 64 armor stands standing down in the basement. Now, here's where that ends. Right. So, for all these armor stands that are a part of the game, we're going to set their has moved score to 0. Because we want them to not have moved at the start of the game. This will only catch all the pieces that are actually in the game, because we're checking that their score in the side scoreboard is at most 1. So their side is going to be 0 or 1, and anything that's not in that scoreboard will not be matched by that command selector. Now, if you know chess, there is this rule that says that if I move this pawn 2 spaces, because it's the big starting move, so I can move him 2 spaces, that skips this space, this white square. So let's say my opponent had a black pawn standing right here. It could have taken my pawn out if I'd only moved it 1 step forward, but now I moved it 2 steps forward, and it skipped this 1 square where it could have been taken out by this black pawn that was standing right here. Then this black pawn can actually strike this white pawn, which is now standing here, by moving here. That's a special rule. It's called en passant, from the French word for in passing, and we need to track that. So that's one of the special rules. We are doing that by we're summoning armor stands that are even further underground, with the special names of W en passant and B en passant to track that. and it's a complicated mess, and I'll go through it later. Finally, we're going to set a whole bunch of things as selectable. So we're setting all the things with a score in the bishop as selectable. Anything that has a chainmail helmet is selectable, because that's the helmet of the king and the queen. We're setting anything with a golden chest plate as extra, because that's the extra piece for the king. So when we move the king, we're actually going to be moving the crown, and then we want his body, which is sort of his extra piece, to follow along. And then we have more blocks like that. We're setting all the pawns to selectable, all the rooks to selectable, all the knights to selectable. We're setting anything that's equipped with a banner to banner, so we can grab that and take it along as well. Any queen that has a skull, we set to extra. And then we clear the inventory of all the players. So now we're basically alright. This block just fills this entire row with glowstone again. So once we get down here, we have a slight delay because we have repeaters set off of this, and they won't trigger if it's just an instant. So after one tick of redstone updates, we fill it all with glowstone again, so that we can be ready to use all those command blocks again. And that gets us to this state, where we have all the pieces set up, all the scoreboards set up. If you haven't saved and loaded the level, the horses are actually in the right direction, and we are ready to start playing. Alright, let's take a look at these command blocks. White move. So remember, these two blocks are the fill clock. That's what keeps this updating every tick. And then we have a whole bunch of blocks that are all executing every time. So we have a scoreboard called selected piece. And that's the point of this scoreboard. Objectives, set display sidebar, selected piece. Now, this is a mess. You can see it's sort of flickering from 0 to 1, and that's because of what we're doing here. But I can't really see, but if I go over here and I somehow manage to pick up the head of this, it stabilizes. And one of the ones of the pieces is set to 1, and everything else is set to 0. So let's get rid of this, and I'll show you how that works. So in order to get a score of selected piece to 1 for whatever I pick up a head from, we start by setting the score to 1 for all the pieces that are selectable. So after this block, all the pieces that I could pick up a head from will have the score of 1. Now, that's not where we wanted to go. We wanted only 1 to have, so now we have to start getting rid of them again. So for anything that is selectable and that also has a skull, we set it to 0. And that gets rid of pretty much all the pieces here in the front. It gets rid of all of these pieces and all of these pieces. However, remember that the selectable pieces of the king and the queen are actually the chainmail helmets, so that complicates this somewhat. Now if we go back here and take a look at the next block, we can see that we have the same thing for a chainmail helmet. So we set the score of anything that's selectable and also has a chainmail helmet to 0. Now after this block, we can be sure that anything up there that is selectable and that still has a score of 1 doesn't have whatever piece it had on the head from the start. So if you go to this one, now what happens when you select a piece? Well, if I select this pawn, we get these two squares because we can move that either here or here in this situation with the pawn, right? But if I instead select this knight, we can move here or here, so we get two entirely different squares. So what we need to do now, after we figure out what piece is selected, is to figure out what to do with that information. So we run this command. So if we have an armor stand that has a score in the selected piece scoreboard of at least 1, and it has also a score in the pawn scoreboard of at least 1, that means we've selected a pawn. So in that case, we're going to execute a fill command and fill in a whole bunch of things with redstone. So that will be a row of redstone, and that so happens to be here. So these glowstone blocks are going to all be filled in with redstone blocks, and all of those are going to execute. So obviously these command blocks are the ones that figures out where can we place a pawn and make sure that we end up in the right state to move the pawn. And then you can probably figure out what comes next. Yeah, if we have something that's selected and as a bishop, then we set another row of redstone blocks. If we have something that is a knight, then we set another row of redstone blocks, and so on. Now, if we have something that is a queen, we fill a line of redstone blocks, and king, another line of redstone blocks. But we also, on this side somewhere... Alright, let's take this from the start. So what's going to happen is, actually, if we select a queen, we're going to place 2 lines of redstone, because a queen's move are exactly identical to both a rook and a bishop's moves, so we are simply reusing those command blocks. Here is more stuff for the en passant. We reset the position of those markers so that we can reuse them once we've made a move. And then, here's what I talked about before, we set the entity data of all the armor stands to disable all the slots. So after this command block has executed, you won't be able to interact with them at all. Once we've done that, we take all the selectable ones, and then we set a disabled slots mask that you have to calculate those, by the way. There's a formula for doing it. They are bit masks. If you've done any programming, you know how that works. But otherwise, what you're doing is you're essentially adding a whole bunch of numbers for what fields you want to be available, and then you get one number from that, and that's what you're setting in the command. But what this does is it will prevent everything on those armor stands except placing a skull. So what we're saying is, at this point, you can only place a skull. You can't replace a skull, which means that the only available move on those armor stands is now to place the skull back. Here we're checking for rooks. And then one more thing we have to do is, now we figure out that we had a selected piece. We're going to execute on that selected piece at the position of that selected piece. And we're going to execute a scoreboard command that sets the score of anything that is a horse in a radius of 0 around that. So any horse standing on the same square. I'm having some major graphical corruption here. Let me restart this recording. Alright, let's try again. So we have a selected piece, and we are selecting all the horses on the same square as that piece, and then we're setting their score in the selected horse scoreboard to 1. So now we know which horse was the one that belonged to any knight that was selected. And then we're going to do the same thing for any armor stand that is on the same square and is an extra piece. And then we're going to set the score of that one in the selected extra scoreboard to 1. So now we can later go and grab the correct extra piece and pull that along when we've moved the primary piece. And then the same thing for a banner, and you're getting how this works by now. Now finally we have the second fail command for the queen. So now we've moved... Wait, what? Set block. Oh, right. Yeah, this is another bug fix that I had to do to get around a bug in Minecraft. So, in the normal case that I do this, I pick up a chainmail helmet named White Queen. Everything is good, but if I do this in a multiplayer setting where I'm not hosting the game, so I'm joining a server or I'm joining somebody else's game that they've opened to LAN, then the name doesn't get transferred properly. So I would just pick up a chainmail helmet and we'll just say chainmail helmet. And that breaks the game because we're looking for those names. So if the selected piece is a queen, then we're going to set one redstone block, and it's going to be -18, 75, 12, which turns out to be this block. So we're setting this block to a redstone block, and then immediately setting it back to glowstone. But by then we've executed these two commands, which clear the inventory of the white player, and then give back a chainmail helmet with the name White Queen. So it's just a way of bug fixing that problem with picking up the head of the queen. For the king, we have the same problem, but for the king we actually have its own set of command blocks that get run to figure out where its possible moves are, so we can use a space on that line. But for the queen, remember, we're reusing the rook and the bishop ones, so we had to create like a tiny little extra space just to deal with the fact that the queen head could be the wrong name. Alright, so at this point we have created all the pieces, we have set up all the initial scoreboards, and we created a whole bunch of cheaty board scoreboards that we can use to create commands that run on the entire board. And we have detected that you've picked up a piece, and we're going to be checking what to do with that piece. But this again is getting quite long, so next time we're going to take a look at how we detect what moves are valid and what moves are not. Before we wrap it up today, I would like to mention something a bit different. The channel is almost up to 100 subscribers, which is amazing. You guys are great. Thank you very much for the support. I'm thinking about making some form of special episode for a 100 subscriber special, and it will be something completely different from these Minecraft videos, but I think that you will enjoy it. Anyway, I will see you next time. Thank you very much for watching.